Welcome back to A Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. In a rare reversal, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has said that there is not sufficient evidence to claim that Tylenol causes autism. This comes a month after the White House discouraged pregnant women and young children from using it because of claimed links to autism. While he was walking back his previous wild claim, he still urged caution. Secretary Kennedy told reporters the causative association between Tylenol given in pregnancy and the prenatal period is not sufficient to say it definitely causes autism, but it is very suggestive. As justification for his previous statements concerning the link between Tylenol and autism, he cited animal blood clotting and observational studies that had led him to voice those concerns opposing the use of Tylenol in those situations. The secretary fell short of actually admitting any fault or wrongdoing in making what now seemed to be entirely false claims, but I suppose him admitting that he might have been mistaken is better than him sticking to his guns even when he knows himself to have been wrong. From the start, though, the entire claim that there was some sort of identifiable link between the use of Tylenol in pregnancy and small children and autism seemed dubious at best to me. I felt like Secretary Kennedy had to have some sort of angle. If he had money in some Tylenol competitor, or if he was shorting the Tylenol stock or something. I guess I felt like there had to be some sort of reasoning behind him making such a bold claim with seemingly no genuine scientific data to back it up. I went looking, and back in 2021, an international group of researchers and doctors did recommend that pregnant women, quote, minimize exposure to the active ingredient in Tylenol by using the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible time, which they based on research that indicated that the drug could increase the risk of neurological and developmental disorders in children. And these findings were published in the journal Nature Reviews Endocrinology. But a more recent analysis of more than 2.4 million children born in Sweden that included siblings not exposed to the drug before birth showed that there was no evidence that acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol, used during pregnancy increased the risk of childhood autism, ADHD, or intellectual disabilities at all. It's important to note that their use of siblings allowed those researchers to weed out other factors that might contribute to autism, ADHD, or developmental delays because siblings share both genetics and upbringing. That study, published in 2024 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, concluded that previous findings of increased risk of developmental disorders were likely due to factors other than acetaminophen. And it's also important to note that acetaminophen is also the active ingredient in cold and flu remedies like Theraflu, Excedrin, and Mucinex. So if Tylenol's active ingredient of acetaminophen really was definitively linked to developmental delays and autism, there would have been a lot more than just Tylenol specifically to look out for and avoid for expectant mothers and for small children. This apparent softening stance on Tylenol and the fact that the scientific research doesn't seem to back up the claims probably doesn't come as good news to Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who announced that he was suing Johnson & Johnson and Kenvue, the makers of Tylenol, alleging that the medication caused autism, despite the fact that experts at studies said that there was no link. But Ken Paxton says that they were deceptively marketing it and that they knew that the pain reliever led to significantly increased risks of autism and disorders. So I have to imagine Secretary Kennedy's statements are not going to help his case very much. And he may even drop it, since I doubt now he's going to have much wind in that sail. But even though he was clearly wrong, you have to almost commend Secretary Kennedy for at least publicly acknowledging that maybe he might have been mistaken in his claims about autism and Tylenol being linked. More often than not, when the facts don't back up these kinds of claims, people like him either never acknowledge that they had made statements that were wrong or try to double down on them regardless of the fact that they were wrong. We can see an example of this in the fact that Trump administration officials have denied that the statements are a softening of his previous stance against Tylenol and claim they are consistent with his previous statements. Though how you can claim that going from Tylenol causes autism to saying that there is not sufficient evidence to claim that Tylenol causes autism is not a softening of the stance, I don't know. But I suppose it is consistent with the administration's inability to ever admit that they were wrong, or anyone within their circle ever said something that was found to be incorrect or not accurately backed up by peer-reviewed research. And speaking of things not backed up by peer-reviewed research, maybe now that he's on a roll, Secretary Kennedy can also walk back his claims about the links between circumcision and autism, since the paper he cited to back up his wild claim, published in 2015, was reportedly riddled with flaws that other scientists at the time pointed out. So this idea that giving recently circumcised infants Tylenol after their surgery caused them to develop autism just isn't backed up by the facts. The study relied on an overly small sample set, and whatever higher rates of neurodevelopmental disorders were found could be linked to other factors within the hospital where these infants received their procedure. There simply is no link to be found. Secretary Kennedy pushing that narrative is just not backed up by the science. So he has to come out and say, yeah, I was wrong about that too. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath. Just getting him to admit that he was possibly wrong about linking acetaminophen and autism was already unexpected enough. Hoping he might own up to 2 mistakes might be asking a bit much, at least right away. Can we take this as a sign of accountability and more fact-based statements out of the Health and Human Services Secretary? I would say no, but it's a nice hope. As it stands, Kennedy has been an abysmal Health and Human Services Secretary, and one, I guess I was wrong, is not going to really fix that or be a sign of any real meaningful change. He was underqualified or really entirely unqualified for his position, and he keeps proving it. I'm glad he admits that there's no obvious and verifiable link between the use of acetaminophen and the development of autism or other developmental disorders. But as the chief guy of the nation's health statements and policies, he shouldn't have been putting out messaging that was not backed up and verified by science in the first place. In fact, quite the opposite. It was very conclusively disproven. So at this point, he's just pushing straight up medical disinformation and pushing it on people who he knows are not going to do their own research, are not going to look stuff up themselves. So if he says, oh yes, Tylenol causes autism, they just take it as a fact because they see him as an authority. They see him as a Kennedy. They see him as the Health and Human Services Secretary. Why would he say something that was simply untrue? Why would he deceive us, they'd say. And I'm still trying to figure out that myself. What exactly was his motivation behind pushing this claim that not only wasn't true, but could be verified to being untrue to published medical research and studies? Secretary Kennedy isn't just consistently wrong, he's provably wrong. And it seems like there's no one within the Health and Human Services Department who is able to say no to him and say that isn't accurate, and here's the proof that it isn't. It's honestly hard to say whether Secretary Kennedy genuinely did not know about the 2024 study that pretty conclusively disproved his claim about autism and acetaminophen, or if he did and just hoped that the masses wouldn't fact check him and see for themselves that these published studies said that he's wrong. Is his seeming ignorance malicious? It's hard to say, and it's tempting to blame the worm that ate part of his brain as to why he seems to have a lot of missing space inside his head for information and knowledge when it comes to health. But my interpretation is that he doesn't really care if he's right or not. He has his thoughts and opinions, and that's what he's going to put out, regardless of whether they're actually based on the reality of science and facts. What I do know is having a head of Health and Human Services that is not fully engaged in the reality around us is a danger to the nation and public health. I know there have been calls for his resignation as a result, but I don't think those are going to come to anything. I definitely feel that he should be removed because he's not qualified for his position, and he is just risking all of our health the longer he stays in that position. I can't even imagine what he's going to be like when we have have another pandemic, but I have to imagine probably pretty poorly. If we thought a mass public health crisis was handled poorly during the first Trump administration, Secretary Kennedy is likely to make that look well organized and well executed, something it absolutely was not. But at least he admitted acetaminophen doesn't give kids autism, so we've got that. And speaking of having that, that's it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time, when I cut you off, another slice of news.